All right. Hey, I know you're into sneakers. So are you like into like other like fashion? I know you like jerseys too.
Yeah. Uh, I have been known to
You like
spot.
a polo? You like a Ralph Lauren?
Yeah, fair amount.
What, what do you think of these?
I was polo on. You got horsepower, crib.
How much do you think I paid for it?
I have no idea. Well, you got a polo connector.
24.95. No, I just found like a random like great price in Macy's yesterday. I was just walking through at the mall.
Get your two chains on. Appreciate you.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, other than that, I think we could just jump in. Yeah, I wanted to talk with you about that's like my main question, like my main thing for this episode, if I could ever find this. Yeah, just you've had some pieces like criticizing like rankings and like play prospect value and like big boards, and it's not only like a lot of people like criticize that type of thing, and I think probably or like our opinions are pretty close on that stuff overall. It's just like we come from like different angles. Like for me, I'm more like being like a little bit more like what is it like accepting, I guess, of it or whatever, or like more seeing the value for it, or maybe seeing the criticisms and kind of trying to come from the other side of it. I think like, but overall our opinions are not that far, but still I wanted to see like exactly like ask you a few questions to like clarify. I think sometimes I don't fully understand your articles because they're like written too smart for me. So like I
Oh,
always want to
thank
ask
you,
you
crib.
stuff. um so yeah, just to get into it, like do you want to like go over maybe some of the criticism, or do you have anything you want to like say on this topic before we
Yeah,
start, or
I think that like rankings are. mm, mm, It's not that rankings are necessarily bad. It's that I think that rankings are like almost futile. Like rankings are so difficult that expecting them to be one thing is the challenge. To say like these are the 250 best kids, or 300 best kids in a high school class, is a topic that like lacks a bit of definition, and that it would almost be better to break that apart into being like these are the 100 best kids for college. These are the 100 best kids for the NBA lens. These are the 100 best kids for shooting, for long-term development. And that like ultimately I think of rankings as they exist now as something that like is very noble work, because I could not fathom being placed under that pressure of trying to take all of these different lenses and come to a list. But ultimately, it's one that I think would be better from stepping back and declaring its purpose a little bit more. For each ranking service, or whether it's a scout or whatever, just being clear about what their inputs are and what they're seeing as the most important degrees would be a thing that would settle a lot of debates. Like the difference between what a 4-star and a 5-star actually is, the difference between what a top 50 kid is or a top 100 kid, or even in a weaker high school class, which we know 23 and 24 to kind of be,
yeah.
is the top 80 kid in 24 about as good as what the 110th kid in 25? Like these are questions that, there is a sensationalist aspect to recruiting, because so many programs, really look forward to it. And as a person who um, doesn't really engage with that side, I understand that's an important piece of like how, how shit goes. But to try to step back and say like, okay, so what matters to this person? And for one ranking service, they may be way more of MBA lens, where tools are so much more important. And then for some of them, it's like, college success. Like I use Trey Green as an example, because like Trey Green is somebody that like, according to different methodologies, should be ranked in really different places. I think on using the balanced on three composite, which is just 25% of each of the four major services, he's in like the 60s. And if you're going to go from like college success point of view, like it's pretty unlikely that like Trey Green is the 60th best, kid going to
Yeah,
be the 65th kid in college.
I mean
Like,
he's maybe the best offensive player in high school, right?
yeah, like in our database, on in like through 79 games, he is at 40% on 475 threes. And like if you ever watched Trey Green play basketball, these are not like catch and shoots
Yeah.
at the line. These are
Exactly,
like
yeah.
double step backs from like the coach's box. And like, if you're again, does that mean that like, if you're taking more of an MBA lens, Trey Green's probably, not a guy that you're, penciling in as like an 100% draft pick. But if you're looking from a college lens, like I don't know how many people I would actually take over Trey Green as for a 2, 3, 4 college year career. And that's just an ultimate challenge for me of rankings is understanding, what the methodology is, what the inputs are, and grading them accordingly. Because like somebody could be like, oh, from an NBA lens, this is my list. And like I could have disagreements with that list, or I could have disagreements with how much focus an NBA should have or does have. And I think these are the broader conversations about rankings that like I've promised myself like I don't get mad about rankings anymore. Like I can't, when I see something that I disagree with, it's just like, okay, try to process this, try to accept it. Because like there's never going to be a list that feels great or feels right because everybody's priorities are totally different. And
Absolutely.
those are the conversations that I've broadly tried to have about rankings, and about like evaluation, in of high school players in this landscape that is so many different people.
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of the like I said, we're not that far apart. Like, I mean, it's definitely like most of what you said is true, but I also don't think it should prevent us or from making rankings or from or prevents rankings from having value. You just have to define those things that you spoke about, right? Like methodology and such.
Yeah. Um, and that's I think a thing that will start to happen over the next 5 years or so, as like we are entering a pretty uh low point for colleges actually recruiting high school players, just due to the extra years of COVID, the emphasis of the portal, and like how easy it is for rosters to turn over. So there's less of a like colleges need to be more right about high school players than ever before. And I think that um, from that concern from college coaches that the high school uh, evaluation community is going to start to be more clear about what it is they're seeing and how they're evaluating, because evaluation for high school guys is like offer lists are smaller than ever. The amount of kids who are like broadly taken is smaller. like high school evaluation is going to be more important, and for it to land the same, it's going to require people to be explicit about their internal processes. So
Yeah,
to me, that seems like a thing that's very much coming in the next 5 or so years.
yeah, no, I agree with college. It's more because it's like a more like a open market, so it's like, more variables. It's not necessarily because obviously the lens of the podcast here and like the stuff we like people on draft Twitter will usually talk about is more like purely on court stuff. Whereas when you're recruiting, it might be because the kid's dad went to your school or something like that. That's like a big. You're more likely to get them. So even if they're not the top ranked, quote unquote, on your list, you might go put more effort into a guy that you're more likely to get for whatever off court reason. But like I think more this podcast obviously more like the draft sort of. So from that perspective, certainly I think it's still important, right? Because you have to most situations you're only gonna be able to choose one guy, so you have to figure out who you're gonna choose for your team. So is that where like fit is it really important to you more than you think most analysts or whatever you want to call it?
Yeah, I would say so. I think fit and archetype are the two things that I probably zoom in on most. Because like fit is like this is a job, and a lot of elements of fit are just like day-to-day job stuff. Like some people don't like being yelled at, and there's places you can go where they have like a top-down culture where like the coach gets after you, and like a dude who doesn't enjoy being yelled at not going to do very well there. Or a place that is really like Miami, where everything is very regimented, let's say. And if you're a person who's maybe like more laissez-faire or just enjoys having your own time or whatever, probably not going to be a fit. And I think that these elements broadly, having a more holistic approach to fit, not just on court, or not just off court, but on court as well, like are like why I had more draft misses early in my career was that like I wasn't doing intel work, or I wasn't understanding like exactly what a coach was asking for a player. And so what I would be like, oh, this kid would be, this player would be in this situation best. I wasn't factoring in all of the things that actually determine whether a player like has a positive career or not. I was just viewing in the very narrow lens of like this team may need this, and team needs in terms of developmental equity, in terms of team investment, in terms of team structure, are like things that are very fungible from year in and year out. I mean, we saw like, Denver kind of, Denver basically went from having a whole bunch of stock in Bones's development, willing to devote a whole bunch of resources, to deciding like they needed to win now and could not do those things in a very short amount of time. And that doesn't mean that like Bones was not a good fit in Denver. It's just that like what they were looking for from a player in that spot in their rotation really rapidly shifted. And does that make the Bones Highland pick a miss? Does that make that evaluation a miss? And if it is a miss, then what reasons were made? I think that there's not enough circumspection about when there are fit misses, why those misses happened. So that's, I think, the things that I've really hammered in on the most. And then if you're thinking of it through an archetype lens, what player in that archetype would have been selected in roughly the same draft spot, and why hypothetically would they have been better or worse? Like those are the pieces that I most like writing and most like thinking about.
Yeah, well, I understand that's, I guess, yeah, that's what you want to, so you're more, it's not that you're necessarily like, don't see the value for it from an MBA perspective. You're more so this is what interests you. So that's why you're kind of, you don't care as much to be like, because like, for me, and I think a lot of people, like it's really interesting to try to somewhat anticipate and become better at quote unquote predicting who will end up like the better prospects. Whereas for you, you're more just interested into like describing how they will sort of make themselves, how they'll play at the next level or whatever, and how they'll fit within various contexts and that sort of thing. Would you say
See, I
that's,
don't necessarily see that those are two different ideas. I think they're two different ways of trying to find the same thing.
you're
Like
right? They
I've
they
just
have overlap for sure.
Yeah, well, I think that I am trying to figure out, who will be the best long term, but I also know that like there are flaws in how I've been thinking about things. And so that I'm trying to sort of test out why some theories that I've had previously didn't work, or why some players that I was like so certain on didn't work. And I'm trying to sort of like rewire those pieces and be like, okay, so I had this assumption about the 2021 draft for these three guys. I was wrong as hell.
Yeah.
Why was I wrong? What went wrong? Where was the miss between this thinking that I clearly laid out and what actually happened? And so it's not that I'm like trying to, not necessarily not trying to predict who will go well. It's that like I'm trying to tinker with my own process to figure out where those misses could have gone wrong, what I could have done, and doing a little bit more of like testing out the ideas that I've had and where they've failed.
Yeah, for me, it's tough to do that without the ranking because I don't trust hindsight. I think hindsight bias is like huge for everybody. And I see it all the time on Twitter. People will be like, "Oh, everybody had Zion number one. That was so obvious." But Zion was
No,
like fifth in
no,
our CCI. You remember?
no.
You know what I mean? Like, and like stuff like
I
that.
remember
That's
trying. I remember like you trying to tell people that like Zion could dribble, and people being like, "Bro, he's playing like Adidas Uprising." It's like, no, he's like really, really good. And like I remember you sending clips of being like, "This is not normal handling," and people like, "I don't know, I have to see it versus real comp." And you'd be like, "That's like top 10 kids he's playing against." I mean,
yeah,
these are the things that people. Not to get into an old timey, the old days thing, but like
yeah,
one of the issues that people have with hindsight is they don't factor in the biases of hindsight, that like there has been a tax against players who did not play UIBL. And so there was a discounting of that stock. There was a discounting of that performance. And so it's like, oh, well, Zion was obvious. It's like, right. But if you go back into Twitter, if you search Zion and go back to, his junior and senior year of high school, you can actually see the arguments that you and Hoy and other people had about like why people discounted Zion down to number 5. You can go read old pieces. And I think that there's just not enough when people do the hindsight thing, they don't actually go get data from that time period. They just assume that like this was what was happening, and it's just not true. Like they do the idea of hindsight. They don't actually investigate, well, why were these beliefs that way?
yeah. I just feel like still even no, you're right, absolutely on that to a degree. But still, I still feel like reading your articles, I don't always have a great feel for who, like maybe in your head you'll know better than me, but even reading my own articles without having a more concrete like ranking, even if it's like in tiers or something like that, or even if it's like guys that are oh, in this place they're sort of interchangeable or something like that. Without having that, I kind of don't trust myself to go back. And sure, maybe like certain if you again if you're going for more descriptive, like looking at certain like traits and seeing, oh, I got these traits right, but I got these traits wrong, I should be valuing this better. That's definitely very important, don't get me wrong. I find value in that as well, but just actually like figuring out the value of the players, I think it's interesting to me. It's, or at least it's pretty useful to me from that lens. Not only that's not the only reason for rankings to me, but that's definitely part of it.
Yeah, I think the other reason why like rankings are very difficult for me is that like, or tiers or whatever, is that like different people just believe different things. Like there are organizations that do not believe that like they can fix shooting in the way that other teams think they can. And there are teams that like don't want to try to teach feel. They just don't believe that it's possible. And like their boards are going to be entirely different because of the underlying beliefs they have about basketball. And like, yeah, if you add in, a superstar, it obviously changes, what you're looking for in draft picks or whatever. Or if a certain player develops an outlier direction. But like having a team agnostic board still requires you to say, I believe X, Y, and Z to be true about basketball development and about like the historical NBA. So like it's one of the things that's like people, the idea is that like a team agnostic board is like this objective reading of the most talented. It's like, no, if you like, there are people who had team agnostic boards with like Zion out of the top 3 or out of the, out of the top 5 or whatever, because they didn't believe that he could like shoot.
Right.
And what like they thought that the evaluation came down to like, will Zion take threes? And in reality, like it doesn't matter. Like it truly does not matter if Zion shoots. Like he does so many other things well. So it's not that they were wrong that like even if Zion like becomes like a solid shooter or knockdown shooter or whatever, it's not that they were wrong for those elements. Is that there was a broad misevaluation happening. And it's because they believed that like there was no way that he could handle enough usage as a cutter, or that the offensive rebounding would be so potent, or that the finishing would just continue. Um, I was listening to like a podcast with like Bomani and Spencer Hall, and they're talking about the NFL draft. And like one of the things that they were sort of like clowning NFL teams for was that like people discount special. So like when people just like when a couple of players they were like talking about like sort of had mythological high school and college careers, like Derrick Henry, who's just like the world's biggest person. He had like 8,000 rushing yards in high school, and people didn't rank him in like the top 5 of his high school evaluations. Like he was not like considered like a super dude, because the logic was like, well, he can't do this again. Like he's not about to violate the SEC. And the answer was like, yes, he is. And then when he was done with the SEC, people were like, well, he's not going to do this again to the NFL. And I think there's like a degree of that with Zion, where like both the hindsight bias and like the broad idea of being, agnostic or neutral, like discount special away. And there's no way to really say, I'm betting against the special here in a broad tier. And that it does require you to write down your priors and write down the things that you believe. So like I think that there are forms of like just writing down a tier list. I have to, every time I see someone's like, here's my top 30, I like try to figure out what they assume about basketball, what they assume about development, what they assume about team building, because like there has to be implicit biases for you to order any amount of talent in a certain way.
Yeah,
And
but I think what do you say to the arguments of like fit, like people that are like the typical argument of fit? One is obviously that there's so much roster turnover, and then also just how much access do we really have to figuring out how much like with some of these off-court things, like as kind of quote unquote layman, how much of that can we really put into our board anyway, like either way. And then like the Zion thing, like it almost sounds like you're arguing for ranking because like you said, it's he was so talented and so good. I think he would have been number one for almost every team, right? If not every
yeah,
team.
it's not like it's that like if you're going to do rankings, you do kind of have to explain what you think about the world. Like I'm let me rephrase that. By doing a ranking, you're there is a subtext of this is what I believe
Absolutely.
about the world. And it would just be easier if everybody actually said the things that they believe. And
I,
and to answer like the fit things, I mean, like you sort of have like, it's not that fit is a one checkbox. It's not fit or best player available. It's like that there's like 10 different types of fit. There's, you know, a cultural fit. There's a current fit. There's a 3-year window fit. There's a 5-year window fit. There's a fit with the current trends of basketball. There's a fit in terms of the developmental strengths and weaknesses of a, you know, of a current program, and like those things can all shift. Like teams can hire and fire, you know, really good or really bad coaches, or coaches with different focuses, and that's why you get kind of these players that don't develop in one situation and move to somewhere else and just suddenly develop really quickly. So like I think that fit is again like an idea that is good but is grossly underexamined broadly. And to the idea that like laymen can't get this stuff, I kind of disagree. If you want to build relationships, you can totally get a lot of this intel. If you want to, you know, go watch 15U games and talk to coaches and really like not just like, oh, I'm here to gather, I'm here to learn. It's like, no, actually be invested in the community. Like you can learn a lot. You know, back in the day, we used to have to like scrounge message boards to learn, you know, what kids were going to schools, and you'd learn people would have like, yeah, the kid doesn't like to be the center of attention. Don't shout his name. So I think that like if you want to do the work, you can learn a lot. If you otherwise, like you're probably going to have a lot of misses that are uh, intel or fit based in terms of like broad stuff, just because you didn't do that work.
I don't know. I kind of struggle with valuing Intel, even if I'm learning more about it. I still don't really know outside like maybe extreme circumstances. I don't really know what's like a good trait for a player to have. Or I mean, I guess you would say I'm guessing this. It depends for every team and coach. It's different.
Yeah, and it
But
also depends on archetype. Like Grady Dick has like legitimately no memory of misses. Like he just like he will miss,
how do
and
you
you can
know
just,
that though? Like,
I mean, like you just talk to people around him. Like I've seen Grady Dick play basketball 100 times at this point. Like I've watched him miss 6 or 7 shots and then just be like, okay, and then make the next three. Just like there's nothing necessarily like, sorry, my phone rang. There's nothing like part of intel is observation. So if you were to go to, you know, like an old AAU coach, an old high school coach, and be like, hey, does like Grady trip out about misses? They'd be like, no. And so like, or I don't know if you're really looking for a source where it's going to say like the article is just like Grady Dick like has a shooter's memory.
no, it's not about the source, but it's more like I just feel like that's you just described every like good shooter. Like
Not
every
necessarily. I mean, I know good shooters who don't have that, who like really like are perfectionists and really worry about misses.
like who?
um
Sorry to put you on the spot. I don't
oh,
expect
I'm
you
just trying to
grasping.
I'm trying to think of the perfect example. um wow, everything in my house is going off. um like there was a point where like Jason Kidd was very worried about misses, and this was like one of the things that made him a better shooter, was like learning how not to worry about misses. Like this is a you know, a historical example. There are some guys in this draft and in previous drafts that like uh have had that trait, but like the one that stands out is just like, you know, J Kidd being worried about it. I think Kawhi's had some troubles with that as he went through the ins and outs of like shooting development. It's a, you know, you kind of, there's not like one way of knowing the issue, because like, you know, sometimes you'll see interviews where the guy's like, yeah, I didn't, you know, he'll say something that sounds off the cuff and it may or may not be true. I think that like if you have a theory, by running it through multiple people who've seen them, whether that's GAs or, you know, people around them, people who don't really have anything to gain, like, no, like agents or whatever, but like, you know, just trying to get a holistic understanding of a person, that's the best you can do. Like there's never going to be certitude in it, and then it like also may not matter. Like some people may have like perfect shooter's memory and they just like don't make enough shots, so like they don't fit in their archetype, and like they're probably not worth a pick. So I mean, there's a lot of people who do intel work on, or do, you know, do a whole bunch of background or whatever, and it's just like, yeah, they're not an NBA dude.
Maybe I'm just not watching closely enough. It just seems like to me like a guy missing 6 shots and then making three in a row. That's like every good shooter, especially these younger
Yeah, but
players.
like some people you can like will pass up shots. Like they will pass up a slightly
That's
open one. They will.
Franz, I remember with passive
Yeah.
shots. Okay, that's fair enough. So you
Yeah.
think,
Like,
but what the people said that was like a weakness for him, and he's played great. But do you
yeah,
think
but
that?
it was a weakness at that point. Like it was a thing that you would want to ask questions about if you were a team interviewing him, right? You'd be like, okay, so we're gonna walk through this game tape. You miss your first four shots. You get a pick and pop. You're wide open, and you don't shoot. What is going through your mind? Like that would be a meaningful intel question. If that happens 3 or 4 times on tape, you do have to ask him about it, and then you have to go to your development people. You do have to go to your coaching staff and be like, "Can you pull him if he doesn't do this? Like, would you pull him? Like, what do we do? Well, are you comfortable trying to fix this?" And like, if for whatever reason they're like, "Yeah, this is something we've never been able to get over," like, you probably should have Franz lower on your board.
Yeah, just maybe I don't I like the comfort with the kind of like what is it called, like uncertain nature of this. I wish there was like a study where they asked like 200 interview questions from like every combine prospect for like 10 years, and then like a psychological profile build up. And also me and the app talked about this, and like the conclusion I kind of came to, I feel like this almost should be left off to like medical professional, like sports psychologists rather than scouts, this sort of like reading into the mind of people.
Yeah, I think that like there are degrees where I'm comfortable with it. Like a lot of times it's just to ask, like I'm never going to be like, oh, this is a confident kid or an unconfident kid, but like in relation to specific moments, like like it's like when big guys get the ball in like way too big a space, and you can see them be like, oh shit, like there's a press break moment. Everybody else is pressed, and they have to decide, am I going to dribble it up, or are we going to call timeout? Like there's a moment where you kind of learn a little bit about somebody. Like, do they have the confidence to try to dribble this up? Is that a good confidence? Sometimes no. I mean, I watch a lot of, we both watch a lot of like lower level Division 1 basketball, and letting some of those bigs dribble up the court can be an adventure. Um, and so like I think that there are things that's like, look, there are bigger issues that like should not be handled by armchair psychologists or people with a notebook. But there are things that you can look at and be like, look, this kid keeps trying to do this like very low results thing. He may be overconfident in his skills. That's something that I would be comfortable with the scout noticing. But like higher order stuff, things that are, like more central, like I don't really get into the body language game. I find it to be really useless. I don't get into the like
Yeah,
a lot of stuff is just like it's either pseudoscience or like strictly
yes,
vibes based. But if it's
right,
something
right.
I can ask people, hey, this behavior keeps happening in this specific moment, what are we feeling about that? Versus like, yeah, I got a weird vibe from when his coach said something. Like the answer may be like the coach said something weird, or they don't have, that's the guy he has the worst relationship with on staff, and that stuff I've always found viewed to be like not scouting and more just kind of like astrology for basketball. um but the sport specific, situational specific stuff, I do think there is real value in.
And also, I find like stuff like every guy who shot poorly, like in the last half of the season, oh, his finger was broke, and every guy who shot well, oh, he just healed. Now he's gonna shoot like that forever. But then
Yeah.
we know, like through statistical research, that like when you like break in half a season stuff into like
Mhm.
half a season into smaller sample size, it's usually not very indicative. It's much
No.
better to just look at the full sample size for almost overwhelming majority of cases. So
Yeah.
like
I
I'm kind
mean,
of skeptical. I like I remember everybody said Cam Reddish, he was hurt. He was hurt and Duke,
yeah. And like, look, I mean, I've, the one that is always struck me was the like, I remember being very, very low on Romeo Langford, because
Yeah,
every
that's
time I'd
another
watch
one.
Romeo Langford, I was like, and he would shoot bad. People would be like, oh, his finger's broken. And like, I still like, I'm going to be honest, like, I've been watching Romeo Langford for like 6 or 7 years now. And like, I don't, the only time that I can really remember people being like that he really shot well for an extended period of time was like the right before, like the, I guess, like week around him playing Lalo in the new Albany Fieldhouse, where he gave like Brian Bowen like
Oh,
just all
all
those
right.
buckets. And like that was the time he shot good and he was healthy. But the rest of it, I was just like, I would be like, hey, so like I don't think he's a shooter. People are like, oh, his finger is broken, or like he has some wrist trouble. But then like
Yeah,
he
it's
started making
always
shots, and like
something.
it's always something. And I'm just like, look, I'm looking at the numbers, and they're like, they're not good. Like somebody talked me through this, and then he was hurt in college, and it was just that stuff. Again, like you kind of have to have your own internal like, I don't know how real this is. Like you have to make these judgment calls. That's like, the reason that we're in this is because like your judgment is valuable, and you learn that sort of how to weigh the good against the bad for years of making mistakes. Like we've all bet on bad shooting numbers and been like, oh no, he was hurt, and then you're like, oh no, it's not real. And then we've both done the inverse. So I think you get burned a couple times and you kind of calibrate yourself.
All right, I'll ask this last thing, then we gotta reset for
Yeah,
tournament. You're okay? You got another 30, right? Or maybe 40
yeah,
minutes or so because I gotta
yeah. I'm good.
download. Yeah, okay. What's it called? Just one thing I wanted to ask is what's it called? So if like would it would say fit is super important, wouldn't it then follow logically that because when you look at historically 1 through 60, the first pick, on average is through, if you look at any like
Yeah,
popular stat like BPM or PIPM or whatever, and is better in the second and third, it's like a pretty like, curve narrow, like I mean, what is it called? Straight curve. Like
yep.
obviously there's some up and down, but wouldn't it then logically, if the fit was so important, wouldn't it be like all over the place, especially like towards the middle?
Yeah, I mean, a world where everyone acted rationally. I mean, like the thing that I've like, the curve isn't necessarily 1 to 1 because like
It's true. It isn't perfectly, yeah.
because there's dips at 2 and 3
Yeah,
because
there's dips
teams
at 2, 3, I think goes up, but yeah,
goes up,
I
and
mean,
then 4 is steady, and I think 5 is the next step. Yeah, but there's
yeah,
like
like
there's like
seven
a
and eight
z
is like a
yeah.
huge, I think, dip. Yeah, yeah.
And my argument is that this is actually a modeling not of expected results, but of teams' ability to evaluate versus their ability to invest. Like there are always people who get traded and they're like, oh, they just did not give me reps. They did not put investment effort towards me. They may have been a fit, they may not have been a fit, but like the one thing that is unified is that like a team is going to put everything it can into pick one. Once you get past that point, there is no guarantee that the meeting point or the intersection between team investment and like and player talent will correlate. You're just much the difference between a first rounder or a second rounder is the team doesn't necessarily have to give a second rounder any level of
So,
run.
so let me ask you this. So the 500th best quote unquote player in the world
Mm-hmm.
could provide star value in the NBA given the perfect fit and
I
opportunity.
mean, theoretically, yes. Like there is an outlier development case in theory. I think that it's more for the players who are spikes. They are interesting because we have to ask, did they get necessary, like not in the like they could have been cold in this era type of thing, but more like what would have had to have happened for them to have a better chance to be successful, not to make them successful, but what investments would have to have been made for them to have a better shot than what they got.
Hmm.
Like Gogo
Okay.
Batadze
Well,
as an example.
yeah, yeah, Batadze is definitely an interesting guy. But anyway, what's it called? If you say like the 500 guy could have star value, wouldn't by that like logic you would go like trade the first pick or whatever? Maybe not the first. Maybe you find 1 or 2 guys that are like Wembanyama and Scooter or whatever that are like stars. But besides that, like, wouldn't you trade like always down and like go to like trade for a bunch of second rounders and like or like just sign like
Yeah, I mean, like in the world where you like just because the 500th best player could bring star value doesn't necessarily mean that's like likely enough to turn your franchise around. Like it's enough to like turn the just because a player could be that, a lot of players could be that. That's not enough to like dictate decision making.
right.
Like it's
So
not
wouldn't
enough to
that
be like, but it means that like historically people go number one for a reason. That's just the likeliest chance to get a difference maker. There are number ones that are not actual stars. There's number ones that are fringe stars. There's number ones that are like great third players on a championship team. It's that like there is also a likelihood that the 500th best player in the world could have been that under optimal circumstances is just far less likely.
right, right. Well, I maybe I didn't ask Square. You're right. That's a good point. What's it called? Yeah, there's a very wide range of outcomes for almost every prospect. I would agree with that. But within realistic outcomes, is it like could fit influence? Realistically, like within like I don't know 90th or maybe 85th, whatever percentile outcome. Somebody who's like hanger on in the NBA, if they would had the perfect fit and opportunity and resources invested in them, would they have brought star value in the right place? Do you think, or
It
It's
also depends on the archetype. Like, I mean, like we saw like 98th percentile Duncan Robinson for a short period of time, right? Like the
yeah,
best possible outcome of Duncan Robinson. I'm probably 100th percentile Duncan Robinson, especially for like, you know, his entry to the league. But like, I don't, I don't know if that, like, if that, you know, however long the Duncan Robinson run was, is star value. Like how many, like like as a borderline question, how many years like has RJ Barrett brought star value at any point?
yeah. I mean, it's definitely up for debate when we go to individual players, but I shouldn't say star value. Maybe I just mean like being like a plus one and two, quote unquote, type of player.
Yeah.
You know, yeah, like just having actual value because we know like us on analytics nerds, we all know that most players are like zero at the NBA level. Like most
Yeah.
guys are quote unquote replaceable.
And I think
Obviously,
that the one thing that like I would necessarily want to discourage is like Coke dreams. Like the idea that like, oh, if we put, you know, a UDFA into like the 1% of what like we could build the exact perfect circumstance for him and he's gonna be, you know, like essentially Carmelo Anthony. Just like we just have to like like nail this like infinitesimal thing. Like that's how you get fired. Like
right, right.
that is like again, that is a thing that like in the most dictionary definition theoretically could happen. But like part of what we're doing is like I mean as a broad draft community is trying to find best practice, is trying to find like what are the truisms, what are the guiding principles. And I think that like fit is broadly under considered, like, you know, fit as a, you know, as a day-to-day fit is kind of how I think about it, like is broadly under considered. That isn't to say like, you know, sell all of, you know, mortgage your future to like open up as many roster spots that you can get like UDFA guys and then try to build their individual, like you're not making a 2K career for just random dudes to try to get them to be Hall of Famers. So I think that like there has to be a realistic expectation of returned value. Like also, if you do this once and it does not work, you will lose your job. Like this has to be handled in a better way. But I also think that like rather than saying the 500th best guy, is that the more that like I'd say the 3-point era has played out, we've seen that like there is far more success than like would probably be anticipated by the previous 20 years of drafting after between picks 16 and like 50.
Right.
That
It's
like
there's a lot of parity in that. I agree. Yeah.
yeah, but it's just like and it's also just like there is more success stories there than really kind of has previously been. The
Oh, I see. I
like
see. Yeah, I
because
think
there's less
we're getting
variance,
smarter. We're
right?
getting
But there's also
smarter. We
more
have more
variance in
frame.
players. There's more variance in player types. Like
Huh.
when you
What do
look
you
at like
mean?
the like so like in the early 2000s, like
Uh,
which I would say is like the worst period of basketball other than like the post cocaine 80s. Like those are the two sort of like those are the two fallow periods of NBA talent. People
late
there were
70s, right? Like,
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Um
yeah.
so like these periods where talent is really low, but also like basketball imagination is really low. So like every like the Jordanaires existed during this time period. Like everyone tried to play like Mike, and it just resulted in like extremely inefficient shooting guards. And now there are so many more broad archetypes that it allows for like unique possibilities to arise that we haven't seen
Mm,
before, just because like new types of guys are getting new types of usage with new play types. And so, because there is a broader basketball imagination, there are more possibilities for guys to hit, which is to say that like there is some truth in the like, what would this guy do be now? Like, you know, when we look at the 80s, when we look at the 90s, when we look at the early 2000s, of like guys who were in a less imaginative time used suboptimally, or even like just lesser. There were lesser pathways. There was less efficient player development and archetyping pathways. So I think that that leads to like just a broader series of outcomes. This also can be negative for guys who like much is dreamed of, like, oh, they could be a lot of things, and the reality is like they also currently are not a good player. They're, you know, they are a concept. um so I think that like with this imagination comes at times over imagination for players. But this also means that like if you really do your evaluation, if you really understand somebody, if you really understand your team, there are huge advantages in a draft if you have like pick 19, where you can be like, oh, we actually do have the optimal environment to get not just like pick value, but like maybe the best pick value in this like 10 pick range, or like, top 5 or 7 total draft outcome, which is like a huge, organizational advantage, just because you understand that you could, like, that you have a narrower uh expectation available. Where if you pick somebody in the top 3, like, you kind of can't pick weird players for super early, just
Well,
because
you
like they're most like
could, but
right, but like
yeah,
it's most likely
it's
not going
more
to work.
rare. Why wouldn't it work?
Well, because like you generally, if you're like, imagine you pick like a really low usage guy who like is a connector. Like
Yeah,
imagine picking like a D'Anthony Melton, like on like a truly terrible basketball team.
right. I got you. So
What is
you're
he going
saying,
to do? Like,
yeah, yeah,
how is
no, I
he going
got
to
you.
get better at basketball if he's
Well,
like
I
no,
don't
no, I
know.
don't mean that. I don't mean that. Like, I don't mean how is D'Anthony going to get better. I'm saying that, like, how does this archetype improve in an environment that is not conducive to them getting like
Yeah,
improving and fine tuning their skills as a connector?
yeah, but I'm a little bit more. I understand what you're saying. I agree to an extent, but I think I'm a little bit more optimistic about like low usage guys being effective even at the like poor environment. Like we see McCall right now, he got traded to the Nets and he's gotten his usage up and he's still fairly effective. And I remember that's kind of the argument. Me and I've had this argument back and forth. And if, funny enough, we use McCall as the example. And I said that in a different environment, McCall would be able to get. I feel like guys that are really efficient at a low usage are able to raise their usage up easier and still keep, somewhat, obviously it's going to lower the true shooting and everything, then rather than a guy who has a really high usage and poor true shooting. They're not going to be able to be super efficient in most cases, even with a far lower usage.
Yeah, I think that I'm imagining a guy who's even weirder than McCall, a guy who can't elevate his usage, but is really good at a lower usage. Like who's all of his value exists on a lower usage plane.
Yeah, but I don't know how
How
many of those guys
Right. That's what I'm
exist.
saying. Imagine a guy. Again,
Yeah.
we're doing theoretical work here, so I mean,
Okay.
it's
Okay. Sure.
a fun thought exercise. But like, imagine a guy who can't actually hold larger usage and is on
Yeah.
just a wasteland of a basketball team. You know that he will return. Again, this is theoretical. A top 3 value when he's placed in a positive environment. How are
Absolutely.
you
Yeah.
how are you gaining actually making this player? How are you actualizing this player in their rookie contract? And like, that's not a pathway of development available to you. Again, like, I'm using an extreme edge case
Right. Right. Right.
to demonstrate the concept, but the like it. But now let's take that same, extremely weird player who I think can return huge value and put him at pick 14. Now I've got a stew going. Now I can like put him in a lot of places where he will not just return value, but actually get the reps he needs to produce in playoff basketball, and which again is like a cheap shortcut to returning higher value, is like being good in a playoff series.
Yeah, but
Um,
my thing would be though, I think that applies almost to every player. Like,
yeah,
like yeah, there are teams that are like a Boston or Raptors or Memphis. I think are like a situation, or Miami to some degree, are very positive, and definitely there's players that fit better within their systems, and the fact that they found the players that fit well within their system is part of why they are so successful. But still, I think almost for I would say at least the majority of prospects, those teams being on those teams would produce better results and better being more efficient and productive and so forth uh, for almost any archetype.
yeah. I think that almost any archetype doesn't really work because we've seen a whole bunch of issues with Vision 6-9 and just like overlapping and them getting a little too far into ideas. And then like when they added Jakob Pertl back, suddenly everybody made a lot more sense. So I think that like you can go too far with any of this stuff, but
Yeah,
the broad idea is that like, because of the investment curve cuts kind of both ways, where players can get played outside of their like can have vestigial developments. Players can like, develop in directions that won't be useful for them like on a better team. And if you are drafted into the wrong environment, I think like Rudy Gay to some degree, although he is a player who like had the eras shift on him, like the best version of him was not the one that was used in his initial segment. Andre Iguodala in Philadelphia very early in his career was seen as like this number one guy, and basically none of the things that made him a great number one, or made him like a passable number one, good number one, I'd
Right.
say, like helped him as the actual peak version of himself in Denver or in Golden State. So like there are finite, like development resources are finite, not just for teams but also for players, and that what teams may need can take away from what a player could be, because they're asking them to do things that are just not ultimately helpful for the player, even if they are marginally helpful for the team. Like Philadelphia needed Andre Iguodala to score. That is not where his particular like actual success rate lay. It was
Yeah.
to be far more of a connector. So those ideas, like that distribution that you were talking about of 1 to 60, to me, a lot of those fallow periods are misalignment of expectations and incentives, both for a team and for a player. Where like number two players who get picked number two, many of them probably would have been much better in circumstances where they're picked number six, where they weren't expected to just be handed 30 shots.
Yeah, the number two curse is definitely puzzling from my kind of philosophical standpoint. I will say
Yeah,
that.
I think that it is that people want the vibes of a number two player and oftentimes ignore what number two players are often good at. And like because they want somebody that can, stick up on the front of the arena or, lead highlight tapes or whatever. But I think that is far more what it is than anything else, is the pressure for them to be like the dude, almost to the exclusion of anything else.
Let me ask you this: you would agree that Jokic and Draymond, like a big part of their value is the fit, right?
Yes.
At Denver, and because yeah, it's interesting. People say that, and it makes sense from like a intuitive standpoint, absolutely, like the way they've been used. But if you look back on draft models, statistical models from those years, they were able to rate Jokic much higher than the consensus, and Draymond also, I think, was top 10 in a lot of models and stuff like that.
Yeah,
So it's interesting, kind of like how
I
that
have I have some thoughts on this one of the statistical premonition, is that like the league is just less likely, in my opinion, to adapt to the current game. Or let me rephrase that. The model assumes a better fit than what will most likely happen. So like the modeling assumes that a team is going to play more modern basketball than most teams were playing at that point. So to go, for Draymond to go to a team that just happened to have a not good coach, and where he wasn't, extremely effective, and then to have a much more modern coach that, sort of figured out the shooting threes is good or whatever.
well,
Like I think that there is not to say that the models are flawed. It's just that like there's an uneven distribution among where players would be selected on how likelihood they're actually going to be maximized.
you would agree though that like upside, we should be like drafting for upside, right?
Yeah. It's just that like you also have to convince people to play you. Like upside is
Right.
cool, but like you have to there's like a test that like kind of dubbed the Lionel Hollins test, which is like imagine trying to convince Lionel Hollins to play this guy. And it's not like Lionel Hollins is a bad coach. Lionel Hollins is just like a guy that I think of as like an hard nosed old school coach, and just like is somebody that just like jumps out to me as sort of an archetype of a type of NBA figure, and like telling him to play some of like the more like quirky advanced stat guys, like what does he do on the floor? Like what is the 5-man theory? Why should he deserve minutes over X, Y, and Z? And so like drafting for upside, there has to be some level of like, like why would people put Poku on the floor early on? Like development for development's sake isn't necessarily something that like you're going to build lineups out of.
Yeah.
And like as much as it's like you do need playing time, like it also has to be logical playing time. It also has to be usage, like appropriate playing time. And like in many places a meritocracy, because like a sign that like your organization is trouble is just like you just roll out the young dudes with no plan and just let them get slaughtered to let you lose games. And like that's a way of really losing a franchise, both from a fan perspective and from an NBA esteem perspective. So I think that yes, drafting for upside is important, but like again, upside as a term is just like could mean so many things. Like that's how you just like draft super toolsy dudes who like super can't play.
Right.
Like,
Well,
is
if you
that
don't, if
upside?
you're, yeah, if you're misdefining terms, of course, if you're going to be
Well, it's not
wrong,
even, but like also like it's just not. I don't think of it as misdefining. It's like the like upside, like upside can means straight up means different things to different people. Like there are people who
yeah,
view an upside pick as like if he can give me 4 good minutes in a playoff game, we are picking at pick 28. If he can like hold together a rotation in a playoff game when our
that seems
starters
like
are off the
we're
floor.
going into like a semantics argument though. Like if you
Yeah,
like,
but I mean like but that's how teams will view that as a that is an upside play. That like we are married to the upside of this current model of our franchise. And again, it is semantics, but it's also like when these terms are not really well defined, you get into places where it's like you just end up saying you're both using the two people are using the word in just a totally different direction. Not that this is like super fascinating or whatever, but this is my experience in talking to like the last couple of years of doing this. You start to interact with like NBA people and decision makers and stuff, and they have a totally different understanding of some of this stuff than we do. So when we say
no,
stuff like
I agree,
upside,
but
you're just like,
I, I,
well,
s- I think I'm right, right.
yeah,
So I trust into my own understanding, and I feel like me and you would upside if we're saying the word upside, we would broadly have similar like definition of that.
yeah,
I think.
yeah. Just speaking to some of the dangers that I found of trying to stay away from like those buzzwords just because they've got me in trouble. Where I'm like upside, I'm like, yeah, here's my top five, and then someone else is like, none of those guys are on mine.
That's
I'm like,
absolutely true. Yeah. It's
yeah,
when I've talked to scouts, there's like certain terms where I'm like, "What are you talking? He has good feel? No, he does. Like Precious Achua has good feel, but then it turns out he's like talking about something completely different. I'm like, what
yeah.
do you what? Yeah. Um, but yeah, just the last thing because my wife was like telling me that I'm taking her time away. What's
Mhm.
it called? What's it called? How what's a good way? Like this is something that I find interesting. Like you wrote a piece on player value and you had some good criticism, I think, of it. But how would you like define on court value? Is there like because the way I defined it for the podcast was just like kind of a analytical lens, like how many points per possession they add to their team on either end of the floor. So just from that perspective, how do you have like a definition or ways to describe or the way you think of value of players just from an on-court perspective, or do you think it's maybe so tied into the off-court stuff that it's impossible to really?
Yeah, I'm gonna find like a more holistic woo-woo definition where it's like, is this player helpful towards the vision of the franchise where like they actually win? So like use the example of like oftentimes teams will have like a 36-year-old stretch four, and it's just he's a placeholder to make the sets work until they can draft the right stretch four, when they're rebuilding or whatever. So I think my definition of player value is like much more abstract because like there are players that are good for bad teams, like in terms of we've moved away from a lot of empty stat discourse, but that doesn't mean that like encore they're a net positive. um i I think that value is one of those things that like is so broadly different. Like I don't like contract discussions, that stuff
Well,
gets
it
very.
sounds like yours is almost like CBA focused.
Yeah, I mean like
But
mine's my idea of team building is or my idea of value is really wrapped up in team building.
yeah, it's
um
more like for because yeah, when I think of Encore Valley, I'm just thinking of currently right now, and then you add the other stuff that to adjust it. Then you add the stuff that plays into future things or like off court stuff or whatever it may be.
yeah, I mean I think a lot like when I think of value, I think of I think we've talked about this before, but like Cade playing pickup when he was a kid. Have you heard these stories that Cannon tells?
No, no.
That like Cade would get put into pickup games against like you know Cannon's college teammates or guys overseas, like high level pickup runs, and then have
Mhm.
to like be given adjustments of like, hey, you have to score every like you're the primary ball handler this time. This time you have to figure it out, and like he's probably really bad in some of those. Like, hey, you're the rim running five. You're a 16-year-old high school sophomore or whatever playing with like grown men and like college upperclassmen. He's probably not very good in that role, but it was probably extremely valuable to him in terms of understanding and his like court feel and understanding of spatial dynamics and stuff, and really like challenging his developing identity as a ball player. That's the stuff that like rings to me for value, where like there are things that are probably like negative short terms that are very positive long terms, and I'm always going to think developmentally. So I don't know if my player value idea is really hammered down more enough than to say like I kind of know it when I see it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my idea isn't, it's a definition, but it doesn't really provide a lot of clarity to my process of
Mhm.
evaluation. That's where I would ask you, like, what I find interesting always is like how there seems to be so many like fundamental and just like skill based stuff that people kind of take for granted, like the way, just a very basic example that I think a lot of people know is shooting mechanics. There's like a textbook shooting
Yeah.
mechanics, but it's not like we've tested all like the grandma shot, the overhead shot, and figured out that this is the best. Like, why do we believe this is the best shooting mechanics? Why don't we shoot? Why don't, it's
I've
just,
I've I've written hundreds of thousands of
yeah,
words
I
on
know
that.
you've written about that
Like
one, yeah, in particular. But there's a bunch of other like on-ball defense, or like say, like when a guy gets better. This is a classic example. A guy gets better shooting off the
mhm.
dribble, but then he starts taking a bunch of long mid-range twos. So his value actually goes down because he's taking a bunch of horrible shots now. Like Blake Griffin is a classic example of that. When he started to get better from the perimeter, his value went down because he's played less inside, and his athleticism also regressed. But even when his athleticism was still at a high peak, you could argue his value kind of went down as his skill, quote unquote, improved.
Yeah, I mean it's so much based in like what version you want to trap in Amber and have forever. Like there was probably a point where if you were to like, model out Blake Griffin's career, there would be people who'd be like, okay, if we can just stop the development here, let's get off this ride. Hey, don't try to like dribble more. We're just gonna have you take these shots. No, we don't need you to figure out if you can do Paul George stuff. Like don't go further. And like ultimately that ended up not being a fruitful development for him. But there are outcomes where that could have. And that's the organizational challenge, is like, do you push him farther into something that like could be there even if the results may be negligible, knowing what his medical tests look like? Or do you say like, look, this is going to be the best version, let's like start working on micro skills within this frozen in amber moment where you're not trying to take long twos? And
Yeah,
that is the stuff that will keep you up at night.
yeah. Well, this was definitely an interesting combo. What's it called? I wanted to say something, but I can't remember. Always my short-term memory is crap. Oh, that's what I want to say. Yeah, the one thing I wanted to get to, but I don't think we'll have time today. And I wanted you kind of have, I think, a little bit more controversial. I feel like I'm the normie on Draft Twitter in this conversation. But next time when you come on, whenever we all have the time, and I want to get Avinash with you on as well. But I want to talk about my more controversial opinion is that I think we disagree on, is where I'm not big on like reps and like even like playing time and stuff like that. I think just most of development almost happens quote unquote naturally just through the age curve. Obviously you need to play basketball to some degree, but even guys we have like research of guys that are like were injured for a year or two when they came out of college, and they still kind of developed over that period when they were out along the age curve. So yeah, that would be, I think, an interesting topic where I think most people
Yeah.
would disagree with me on that
Yeah,
one.
you ultimately are a talent essentialist. Like you just
Yeah,
believe that there is
yeah,
true. So yeah, you heard it here
yeah,
first.
kind of, kind.
Mike Gribb says draft Daniel Skilling's top 30.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm available whenever you need me, Grip. I always love doing these, and you know how indebted I feel to you
Oh, come
for
on.
really getting it, for helping me really get into this. So
Uh, oh, please. You're like the best writer on Draft Twitter you would have got for sure where you're at, as long as you tried.